Liz, can you hear us okay?
Okay, silent. First things first, right?
Yes. Perfect, thank you.
Okay, so we all good on Zoom?
All set.
We're recording?
Yes.
Okay. Just checking. Okay, at this time, I'd like to call to order the Lyon County Board of County Commissioners and Churchill County Board of Commissioners. This is Monday, December 12th, 2022 at 5:30 p.m. I'm going to do my roll call and then I'm going to turn it over to Commissioner Chairman Olson. Please note that Commissioner Henderson, Commissioner Hockaday, and Commissioner Jacobson and myself are here. And Commissioner Olson, would you like to call your board? I think you're on already.
Okay, Commissioner Heath, Commissioner Sharman, and myself, Commissioner Olson. We're all here, present and accounted for.
Yes, I always say myself and assume everybody knows who I am. So, anyways, welcome. Nice of you guys to come join us in our neck of the woods this time around.
Yes.
So, now that we've done our roll call, if everybody could please rise and we will have the Pledge of Allegiance. Commissioner Hockaday, if you could please lead us.
Ready? Begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of
the United States of America, and to the republic for which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Everybody wants to put a comment in there. Okay, please note at this time, we will go to public participation. No action will be taken on any item until it's properly agendized. It is anticipated that public participation will be held at this time, though it may be returned to at any time during the agenda. Citizens wishing to speak during public participation are asked to state their name for the record and will be limited to 3 minutes. The board will conduct public comment after discussion of tonight. It says agenda action items. All of these are presentations tonight. So we will actually take public comment after all presentations have been made. But we will, as it states, we will take public comment before taking any action. But please note that our agenda tonight is not an action item. It is a presentation only workshop. Well, so we'll have discussion. So at this time, I'm just going to ask if anybody had something they wanted to bring forward under public participation that doesn't have something to do with the presentations. Seeing none, for possible action on my board, review and adoption of the agenda. Can I get a motion, please?
Move to adopt the agenda as printed.
Second.
Okay, I have a motion and a second. Any further discussion? Public comment? Seeing none, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? Okay, Chairman Olson.
Any discussion on the agenda? Motion?
Move to accept the agenda.
Second.
They moved second, accept the agenda as presented. All those in favor signify in the affirmative.
Aye.
Aye.
Aye. Motion passes unanimously.
I'm sorry. Oh, who made the motion?
Oh, Justin Heath made the motion. Justin Heath.
Sharman seconded it.
Yeah, Aaron's not used to everybody's name yet, so thank you, gentlemen. So at this time, we're gonna get going here at 5A for consideration, discussion, presentations, and discussion on the Carson River upstream and downstream issues in the Carson River watershed and perspective to include. And then the first one here is so that I can basically welcome you guys. So it says Vida D. Keller, but that's me, Chairman of the Lyon County Board of Commissioners. Anyways, I want to again welcome you gentlemen to our neck of the woods. I appreciate that we're having this workshop together, the two counties. And it's great to see that we have, full boards on both sides. So thank you very much. And I want to thank Commissioner Olson for reaching out to me to accomplish this. So Thank you very much. So our first presenter tonight is Chris I always want to say your name wrong. There's too many H's and N's.
Rhymes with banana, Mahana.
Mahana, thank you. I know that, but I looked at it and I went, whoa, wait a minute. With Mahana and Associates LLC. Speaker introductions and brief presentation on the downstream perspective, basic capture concepts, concerns upstream Lawton, additional demands from upstream growth and over appropriated basins. And I believe Aaron already had you sign in when you got here.
Correct, yes.
So, thank you.
Is this on or do I need to push this?
You're on, the lights on.
Okay, great. Aaron, oh, there we go. So again, my name is Chris Mahana with Mahana and Associates. I'm a civil engineer, water resource consultant, representing Churchill County, TCID with Fish and Wildlife Service, and a number of farmers and ranchers in Lawton Valley. Really appreciate full board on both Churchill and Lyon side. Pete thought this would be good to have this workshop. We did one very similar to this in 2018. Pretty much the same players with the exception of a couple of different faces, just to talk about upstream, downstream water issues. So with that, we'll get started.
Would you like to advance the slides yourself? Or do you want me to just do it?
You can do it. Yeah, that's fine. So thanks, Vida, for the introductions. So following me, we'll have Kip Allender with the Nevada Division of Water Resources or the State Engineer's Office. Kip formerly was with the USGS. He's now a DWR, the state engineer, and he'll give a excellent presentation on kind of overview of groundwater hydrology, capture concepts, work they've done on the Humboldt River, and issues that have come up in Smith and Mason valleys regarding groundwater pumpage. Ramon with the USGS, I think he's attending remotely. Ramon's been a little under the weather, so Kara Nadler with their office, the USGS, will present a presentation remotely. We have Ed James with the Carson Water Subconservancy District. He's been the manager of that group for quite a few years now, and he'll talk about Carson River watershed planning and ongoing and anticipated studies. And then wrapping it all up, we have Adam Sullivan, current state engineer. We're pleased to have Adam here and all of you on a Monday night. Then we'll kind of wrap it up with a Q&A discussion. We also have Ben Shawcroft, the relatively new manager for TCID. Ben may come up and make a few comments. So next slide. So the objectives: to create an educational forum on upstream and downstream water issues to be discussed and gain a better understanding of science, positions, water rights administration, and to hopefully avoid or minimize conflicts. So I'm sure many of you have seen this photograph on the right. Just a quick side story. My late father, probably in the late 1970s, was working, I think, under Ed's group or for Ed's group, in anticipation of the Alpine Decree to measure diversions in the Carson Valley leading up to the Alpine Decree. So he and a retired older gentleman were up to their hip waders measuring a diversion, and a farmer came out with a 12-gauge shotgun, asked him, what are you doing? My dad attempted to explain that, we're taking measurements for the Alpine Decree and dividing up water. And this fella said something to the effect of, Sonny, this is how we divide water up out here. So I too have had a 30-06 aimed at my chest measuring water, so it can be a controversial subject. So hopefully nobody brought shovels or shotguns tonight. So next slide. So I'm sure most of you know this is just a slide from the USGS showing the Carson River watershed. It originates obviously in Alpine County in California. The east and west forks come together. Carson River flows in what they call the upper basin, which is basically everything upstream of Carson City. The GS has defined the middle basins as Carson City or Eagle Valley, Dayton Valley, Stagecoach. And then the lower basin would be everything below Lahontan Reservoir. So TCID, Churchill County, their water supply is primarily from the Carson River, and it's augmented by diversions off the Truckee through the Truckee Canal to Lahontan Reservoir. Capacity of Lahontan Reservoir is about 310,000 acre feet with flash floors about 285 without. The Truckee is considered a supplemental supply. There's been literally half a century or more water battles on the Truckee, trying to minimize diversions off the Truckee for environmental purposes for Pyramid Lake. So once the water reaches Lahontan Reservoir, everything downstream of the reservoir is what's termed the Carson Division. And water is distributed through canals, laterals, et cetera, to serve the farmers in the Fallon area. And as a result of that mainly unlined conveyance system, that recharges the aquifer for Basin 101 or the Lahontan Valley. The only natural recharge to Basin 101 comes off the still waters. It's about 1,300 acre feet. Most of that gets rejected into the Carson Sink on the far right there. So Churchill is for their municipal Fallon, the Naval Air Station is totally reliant on the artificial recharge that occurs from distribution of surface water. So next slide, please. So just to kind of give you a feeling for the percentages of how much water comes from the Truckee versus the Carson, it varies significantly year to year. Here's a selection of years. The ones shaded in blue are very wet years. And the second column there is the Carson Division allocation, or in other words, how much of an allocation the farmers get in any one year. The green shaded would be more of an average type year, the yellow, and then the brown would be drought, particularly 2015 would be a very dry year. So you can see in the very wet years, the third column over there is Carson River inflow to Lahontan at Fort Churchill. 9706, almost 500,000 acre feet. 2017, we all remember a huge flood year, almost 1 million acre feet. Everybody's looking to get rid of water, spread water. So the diversion off the Truckee side is in the single digits, 1-4% in those types of years. In more average years in the green, 2012, 2020, it's in the 30 to 40% range. And then in very dry years, you'll see in 2015, more than half, 61% came off the Truckee. So that just kind of gives you a feeling for the percentages this particular year. And Ben may talk about this. The Truckee Canal was shut off in mid-November for lining repairs associated with the flooding in Fernley years ago. The canal will be shut off until probably September, so there will be no flow coming over to Lahontan. Lahontan currently has 22,000-ish acre feet in it. So anticipating this presentation tonight, I did my informal snow survey this morning by taking 6 runs at Mount Rose, and I can report that the news reports are accurate and they did get 5 feet of new snow. So let's pray for continued atmospheric rivers to keep the Carson flowing and fill Lahontan, as well as satisfy all the needs upstream of Lahontan. Next slide. So this is a quote from a presentation that I heard probably 25 or 30 years ago from an attorney in Boulder, Colorado. And it was kind of a provocative statement, but when you break it down, and Kip will go into this in much more detail of the source of water for wells. And this guy put up this slide and he says, wells take water. all groundwater originates as surface water. It's just a matter of timing. So Nevada has historically administered groundwater and surface water separately, which can create conflict since they are a connected water resource. There has been some exceptions to this. If you look back at rulings of Roland Westergaard, Peter Newman, and then now Jason King, and then Adam Sullivan, they understand this connection and they are trying to wrap their arms around this elephant, and it's not an easy task. Next slide, please. So it's kind of hard to see the top there. I asked these questions of Jason King, who was here in 2018. What keeps Jason up at night, or what keeps Adam up now? Severely appropriated basins exceeding the perennial yield estimates, proliferation of domestic wells. How do we conjunctively manage groundwater and surface water that are connected that previously have been administered separately? And then how do we mitigate those? So I'm sure when Adam gets up here, he'll tell us how he solved all of these and adds to the list. But this is somewhat akin to unringing a bell. It is a very difficult task, particularly number 1 and number 3. Domestic wells, if any of you were at the legislature a couple sessions ago when there was domestic well legislation, all I can say is a good thing they had metal detectors at the door, because it's a very hot topic as well. Next slide, please. So what is perennial yield? This is a slide from John Benedict's presentation at Ed's Carson River Water Forum earlier this year. John's a hydrologist with State Engineer's Office. What is perennial yield? And there's a number of terms here that are somewhat used synonymously in the water resource field: perennial yield, safe yield, basin yield, sustainable yield. And a very generic description is a fixed quantity of water that can safely be removed from an aquifer system over time without causing undesirable effects. John gives an excellent presentation from the State Engineer's Office how perennial yield concept has evolved. There's a YouTube link here to his presentation. Next slide. So this is a more specific definition that the state engineer, this has appeared literally in probably hundreds of rulings, the State Engineer's Office. And bear with me, I'll just read it. The maximum amount of groundwater that can be salvaged each year over the long term without depleting the groundwater reservoir. Perennial yield is ultimately limited to the maximum amount of natural discharge that can be used for beneficial use. The perennial yield cannot be more than the natural recharge to a groundwater basin, and in some cases less. So you'll notice the use of the word maximum twice there. And then at the end, they say sometimes it's less. So keep that in mind when we go to the next slide. So this is all of the basins upstream of Lahontan Reservoir, starting with Carson Valley, working our way downstream, Eagle, Dayton, Churchill. Perennial yield. These are the estimates primarily done by the USGS in the 1960s and 70s. In some cases, like Dayton Valley, there's been updated studies. So you can see the perennial yield estimates in the third column. The fourth column is the committed rights, including an estimate of domestic well use of permits that the state engineer has issued. And you can see that almost in every category, more than twice the perennial yield has already been allocated. And this doesn't even account for sometimes less in the previous slide. And we'll get into that more on capture and conjunctive use issues. Churchill Valley, where we're at right now, that's the worst case situation where we got 1,600 acre feet of perennial yield and almost 12,000 acre feet of permitted underground rights plus domestic well estimated use, are almost 7 times what's there. So overall, we're almost 2.5 times over appropriated. Next slide. So this slide's a little bit dated. It's the one I had in 2018. This is showing all active underground points of diversion for water rights issued by the state engineer. Next slide. This is that same slide with domestic well logs overlaying on it. So you can, this kind of paints a picture of a concern and the issues we're dealing with. Next slide. So this is an excellent publication that was put out primarily by Stan Leak with the USGS. Probably, I don't know, what, 10, 12, maybe 15 years ago. It's called Understanding and Managing the Effects of Groundwater Pumping on Stream Flow. Let's just shorten that title to capture, because and Kip will go into this in a lot more detail. But it's you can find the publication online. It's a very good publication that kind of breaks down this issue of groundwater pumping effects on stream flow. Next slide, please. So this is just kind of a generic hydrograph. We got flow on the vertical axis, time on the horizontal of flow in a stream. And the little blue up and down, that is the total flow in any particular stream. So the little blue blips would be, say, reservoir releases, storm events, spring runoff. And then the black line would be flows that you might expect to see in the midsummer, late summer, where there's no reservoir releases, there's no spring runoff. There's just a groundwater contribution to the stream that's causing that to continue to flow. It's what we call a gaining stream. And if you're pumping groundwater that's intercepting that gaining water, you're capturing surface water. And again, Kip will go into this in a little more detail, or actually quite a bit more. Next slide. So we have Norm Frey in the office, or in the audience. I have a network of about 30 wells, and this is a program that Ed's group through CWSD. We've been monitoring water levels in the Lahontan Valley for a little over 10 years, in some cases 20 years in wells. And I go out every month, measure the wells, and this is 2 wells on Norm's place where the Frey Corral well and the Frey House well, and also Carson River stage immediately adjacent to the wells. So you can see there's a very good correlation. When the stage of the stream goes up, water levels in the wells go up, and just the contrary during lower stages. So this is a pretty dramatic demonstration of the connection between groundwater and surface water. Next slide. So again, the top's kind of cut off. This is typical sources of capture. Kip will go into this in more detail, but the upper scenario there is where you have what we call a losing stream, where the stage in the stream is higher than the surrounding water table, and water is actually being lost from the stream into the groundwater aquifer. So if you put a well adjacent to that, pump it, and you have this cone of depression, you can actually induce more loss out of that stream. That's called a direct withdrawal. The middle scenario is where you have a gaining stream. So the water table is higher than the stage in the river. So groundwater is flowing into the stream. And then you put in a well, pump it. So then you're intercepting groundwater that would have otherwise flowed to the stream. Both of those are term capture, whether it's coming directly from the stream or you're intercepting water that's going to the stream. The last one is another source of capture, where as you're pumping and you lower the water table below the root zone of phreatophytes, and you reduce evapotranspiration, that's another type of capture. And again, Kip will go into this in some more detail. Next slide. So this is just a couple quotes out of an article that was published by a pretty well-known hydrogeologist, John Bredehoff, in Groundwater, Journal of Groundwater. And it says the idea of the safe yield, which is like that perennial yield we talked about earlier, which is the size of a development, if it's less than or equal to the recharge is considered to be safe, is fallacious. Then he goes on to say often streams are depleted long before the pumpage reaches the magnitude of recharge. Next slide. So this is a GS slide. This is because the groundwater and surface water are connected systems. The amount of pumping without adverse consequences has little to do with annual recharge or that perennial yield number we talked about earlier. Next slide. So with that, I'm sure most of you recognize this as Alpine County and upper West Fork of the Carson River. So with that, I'll turn it over to Kip. At the end, we can have some Q&A and once everybody's done. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, moving on. The next one on the agenda, as he mentioned already, was Kip Allender, hydrologist with the Nevada Division of Water Resources. He's going to give us an overview. I can't talk tonight. It's been a long day. Of groundwater hydrology and capture concepts, brief update on Humboldt River capture model status and water resource status in the Smith and Mason valleys. We should have did this during the day while I was awake. Sorry. Kip, welcome.
Great. Thank you. And it's a pleasure to be here tonight to address the Joint Commissioner Chamber here. I look forward to giving this presentation. I was, as Chris had mentioned, I had been at the previous Joint Commissioner meeting back in 2018, but I was with the USGS then. But are we having a problem with this presentation?
Yeah, it just doesn't want to share the Zoom when they.
Oh. But needless to say, I was just going to give a little bit more information about myself. I've been working in Nevada water resource issues for over 30 years, and it's been a pleasure working at the state, working more directly with Nevada's water resource issues. You might be able to go into PowerPoint and then open it from in there, and it won't be in the slideshow. Oh. Wait, is there a way to minimize that top bar?
I don't.
Okay. All right. Well, we'll get by. No problem. Oh, great. So, as Chris mentioned, one of the major points that goals for me is to help establish a foundation of understanding of how groundwater, surface water works. And it's really helpful just to have that foundation for understanding some of the management issues and some of the issues that we see in the Carson River Basin, but also more regionally. You also see that I'm not going to talk about the Carson River Basin because Chris has done a good job of doing it, and I know Ed's going to cover some of the issues that are occurring in the Carson River Basin later on. But it'd be good to give a broader perspective and to talk about what's going on in the Humboldt River as well as some of what's going on over in Smith and Mason Valley. So with that, let's get to the show. Next slide, please. So next slide. So this is the first set of slides is going to talk about groundwater and capture concepts. It's a little bit redundant with what Chris was talking about, but I want to make sure everybody has this foundation because it's really important for understanding the issues that Nevada is facing with some of its watersheds. So starting from the very basic, what is groundwater? And groundwater is, and I think everybody here has this knowledge. Groundwater is the liquid water that sits in the pore spaces underground. It also exists within fractures in bedrock, such as in granite and volcanic rocks. And then we also have we have cavernous or solution cavities within limestone or what we call carbonate rock. And that we don't have that in Lyon and Churchill County very much, but in eastern Nevada and southern Nevada, there's a lot of carbonate rock aquifers. And so the water exists within these pore spaces, these fractures, these solution cavities. And there's two really important principles that really, for a hydrogeologist like myself, this is what we pay attention to. This is what dictates how water moves through the ground. And that's the permeability, which is the ability for that water to move through that material. And then also storage, which is how much water it can be stored within a unit volume of that aquifer material. Next slide, please. And the basic concept with groundwater is that it originates in uplands as recharge from either direct precipitation on the soils or on the rocks, and it infiltrates down until it reaches the water table. A lot of the recharge in Nevada, it comes from these small mountain streams that flow most year round and flow out over these alluvial fans and spreads out and then just disappears and drops, because when the alluvial fans are formed, its coarse material is deposited and it's really porous. And so the water just sinks right into it and gets into the ground that way. And that's where a lot of the groundwater in Nevada comes from. And once it gets into the groundwater system, it then moves according to that permeability along the groundwater flow path, down gradient, which is down, we call it head, but it's down lower in water level until it reaches some discharge source. And then it comes back up and surfaces. And the discharge surfaces that we have in Nevada, there's really two most common ones, and that's streams and springs is one of the most common ones. And then the other one is through evapotranspiration from vegetation. And Chris touched on that a little bit, and that's a really important because in Nevada's a closed basin, and the Great Basin. And so ultimately all water leaves by either evaporation or transpiration from the state. Now you hear the term aquifer, what's the difference between aquifer and groundwater? Well, groundwater is everywhere. It's all connected, and it's all connected into some relative degree of fashion. But it's considered an aquifer when you can stick a well in it and pump it and actually be able to supply whatever your needs are. And that's when you can refer to it as aquifer. And if you put a well into place, you can find water, but you can't pump it. Well, a lot of times that's considered what we call a confining unit or an aquitard. And it's just like there's water there, but it can't move because the permeability is so small. And so you get those alternating conditions of more permeable, less permeable, more permeable in our groundwater aquifer systems. Okay, next slide. Okay, Chris talked about the groundwater surface water a little bit. This is a really important concept. It's essential to management of groundwater and surface water in the state of Nevada. And that's why groundwater and surface water are a single resource. Chris did a good job explaining this. And basically, our understanding and knowledge of the systems in Nevada is that the streams that flow year round are almost all connected with groundwater. So that when we say connected, these images right here kind of show what we mean by connected. It means that at wherever that stream is, the water table is at that same height as the stream. And so what we see is this dynamic condition that happens with these streams and the aquifer systems where, during the spring snow melt, the streams will come up and they'll be elevated and they'll be higher than the water table. And so they'll start losing into the banks and into the groundwater system and start recharging the groundwater system. And then as the crest passes and you start to have that recession, that seasonal recession, and then the water, the stream level starts to drop below that of the aquifer, then the water starts to come back into the stream. And so we have this dynamic condition that occurs all over the place where the water's going into the groundwater is going into the stream or it's coming out of the stream, and it can change. In some places it's in a general direction. And then sometimes there's conditions where if there's enough pumping or some other unique condition where you actually drop the water table below that stream, you can become disconnected. But generally with streams that flow year round, they are connected. Next slide, please. All right, so so this slide demonstrates the principle of capture, and this is the story about where water comes from when you pump a well. It is kind of, you put a well in the ground, you pump it, water comes out. It is a little bit, mystifying. Where does that water actually come from? But over decades of science and research and developing of this understanding, it's well known now that this is the principle. This is how water a well derives its water. In that upper panel on the right, which you can't really see right now, there's no pumping going on. It's showing us aquifer system and a river system in equilibrium, and the recharge is entering the ground aquifer, it's flowing out and then discharging to the stream. It's also supplying phreatophytes and riparian vegetation. Oh, thank you. And so that's what we would call a dynamic. That's what we call equilibrium. That's what this system looks like before there's any wells pumping. And it's really however much water is entering is how much water is discharging. The idea behind perennial yield is that amount that's entering, it can be salvaged through pumping. But what happens when you put a well in? When you first put a well in, all the water comes from the ground around that well. So we call that storage. And the chart on the left shows that the left axis is percent of pumpage. So when you first start pumping, 100% of that water is coming from storage. But as time goes on, that depression starts to create a gradient that reaches outwards and stretches outwards and it starts to intercept streams, springs, and also starts to lower the water table beneath those phreatophytes. And so you start to capture what that discharge used to be. And so you get an increasing amount of that supply of water to that well is coming from those sources. And so that's what these curves are on the bottom, showing an increasing amount coming from stream capture and an increasing amount coming from ET capture, while storage change is going down. Now, if you add those three curves up at any time along that horizontal axis, they always add up to 100%. Another really important point here is that you sometimes hear this term stream flow depletion, and we talk about stream capture. They're the exact same thing. And so just want to make sure that's clear. Next slide, please. So now if we take this concept of the capture curve here, and we start looking at from a management perspective, this is kind of how we're starting to really see things in the state of Nevada. When you we have this what we call perennial yield, and that's what's been given out for groundwater users to use, and that's what's the basis of the appropriations in our geographical basins, our hydrographic basins. And so that's really like the concept of the ET, capturing that ET. That's what's available for the perennial yield. But the problem that we're having is that there's an incidental amount of taking from these other water bodies, these streams and springs that already have water rights on them. And so that's this incidental conflict that's occurring. And so that's what, we're trying to get our management around is this incidental conflict. And that's a lot of what the discussion is and what we're going to talk about on the Humboldt. Okay, next slide, please. Oh, the other thing you're going to hear about today are groundwater models. So it's important to kind of talk about, well, what are groundwater models? And really what the groundwater models are, they're a mathematical representation of these really complex hydrologic systems that you can't just understand them by going out and just doing a few calculations, because everything's connected. And then when you try to change something in one place, it's going to change something in somewhere else. And there's this really complex equation that defines groundwater flow, and you can't just solve it readily and easily. So we have to use these numerical methods, and that's what groundwater models are. And it's based on the principles of the groundwater flow equation. It's based on the aquifer properties of the permeability and the storage I was talking about earlier, and it's based on boundary conditions, where the streams are, where the springs are, where ETs are occurring, things like that. On the image on the right shows in just to kind of highlights a model that has been built for the Upper Carson. This is Carson Valley. It was called for the Water for the Seasons project, which they characterize the inflows and the interactions with the groundwater system. They even put in all the water rights and all the distribution to really do a pretty good job at simulating what those interactions were. And so, next slide, please. And I think this says, can you move that box real quick? And just make sure to get the title. What are groundwater models used for? So this slide is so this slide is intended to highlight what the kind of how you can use models and why we need them and what we use them for. And really it's to get into a sense of how any changes in the water management or in climate or not doing anything or other changes in other conditions, how are they going to impact our water supply? And so we use models a lot to do this now, because it's so complex and everything is so connected. And so this shows the results of using that previous model I was showing you on how climate change and temperature and warming affects the supply of water in the Carson River into Carson Valley. And what it shows on the upper right plot there is that as the temperature warms, that's along the x-axis, is that the peak flow, the runoff, starts to shift earlier into the season. And, before any change in temperature, the peak flow is like mid-May. But if we see up to a 4-degree increase Fahrenheit in temperature, we expect that it can be it's going to shift that peak flow much earlier in the season to about around mid-March. And so what that means is a lot of that water that's running off is now coming off earlier in the season before irrigation even starts. And since there's no upstream storage, a lot of that water is going to pass downstream of where the irrigation is occurring in the Carson Valley. And because of that, and because there's supplemental groundwater, they're going to use more groundwater to make up for it. And so that's what these lower plots are showing, is what the expected pattern in change is for each degree of warming associated with the increase in use in supplemental water to make up for that earlier snow melt. Next slide, please. All right. So that was overview. Now we're going to turn attention to Humboldt River Region Capture Study, which is an example of where we're dealing with this issue head on. It's challenging, but it's an undertaking. But it's what we're working on. I'm going to share with you some of what we're finding out. So next slide, please. So the problem in the Humboldt is that the irrigators in Lovelock, they're the furthest downstream, and yet they're the most senior in the system, and expect to have that water in most years. And in the drought of 2012 through 2015, the river actually dried up for the first time. The Humboldt River down there had never dried up before, and all of a sudden it dried up. And so they're sitting down there with no water coming in and looking upstream, and they see all this groundwater irrigation going on next to the stream, and they're getting full crops upstream, and they're getting no irrigation downstream. And they're hearing, from the USGS about, hey, wait, there's this capture thing that can happen. And so they started wondering, hey, is this going on in the Humboldt? And is this impacting our water supply? And so they decided it was, and so they decided to sue the state engineer for not protecting the surface water rights, the senior surface water rights. And so that lower picture that Chris had showed earlier is just a great picture for representing conflict. And so there's this conflict occurring in the Humboldt and suspected capture. And so the state engineer started a big study with USGS and the DRI to try to estimate what the scale of the problem is in the Humboldt. Next
Did it
slide.
dry up because of upstream use?
That is a good question. I'm going to answer that in just a few slides.
All right.
All right. So the study that was taken on was, well, to better understand capture, you got to understand where your water is. So we had an ET study look at where all the ET discharge is taking place in the Humboldt River Basin and how it's changed over time. And then also to use three models, one for lower, middle, and upper basin to estimate how much capture is occurring and also to get a sense of what that connection is. And so I'm going to show you some model results, which is going to get to your question. So next slide, please. This is just a quick slide showing a summary from the ET discharge study, the fantastic work by DRI. This has been released. That's the link right down there and take you to that report. And the slide on the right kind of summarizes the big scale picture of how much ET is occurring or was estimated for each of the hydrographic basins. All right, next slide, please. So this is getting to your question here. So this is the preliminary result for the upper Humboldt River Basin. This chart right here shows the pumping is the bars there. In acre feet on the left. And then on the right axis is the stream flow depletion, which is those colored curves on the bottom. And each of those curves represents the amount of capture that's estimated to be originating from each of those hydrographic basins that make up the upper Humboldt River Basin. And it projects out 100 years. So the key takeaway here is that we're estimating that's on the scale of 12,000 acre feet per year of capture is occurring in the upper Humboldt River Basin. And if the pumping holds steady because of the nature of the way the upper basins has so many connected tributaries, it's estimated that most of that impact's already occurred and it's going to hold mostly steady, increase a little bit over time. So 12,000 acre feet. So next slide, please. And then this one's summarizing for, oh my gosh, look at the fonts on that. That's terrible. This is for the middle Humboldt River Basin. And unfortunately we lost the projection. So where those bars all of a sudden drop off, that's the estimated from the historic on the left side, and then to the right's the projection. And so we've estimated that the amount of capture that's occurring in the middle Humboldt River Basin is right around, believe it or not, 12,000 or so acre feet per year as well. But it's expected to continue to increase over time because the nature of the distribution of pumping with respect to the water to the rivers and streams is different, is more spaced. And so that impact takes longer. And so it's expected to go upwards to up towards 25. So currently we're looking at around 25,000 acre feet and projecting upwards of 35,000 acre feet in 100 years if pumping remained constant at that level in 2016. And so that kind of answers your question. I hope that we estimate that, yeah, we think the pumping has intercepted some of the base flow that was kept the stream wet during the dry years. There's other compounding factors that go on there though, with the mine dewatering, because mine dewatering, it started in the 90s during the first drought, and that supplied water to the river that kind of masked the capture that was going on. But then in 2012, during the 2012 to 2015 drought, the conditions, the capture started exceeding that discharge. And so then it started becoming more apparent.
Years ago, I was at a meeting in Lovelock, and in which the state engineer was presenting. It was pretty clear that upstream use was the reason why they had no water. So
Next slide, please. All right, now we're going to talk about something a little bit closer to home, and especially for Lyon County Commissioners, Smith and Mason Valleys. And this one I really want to talk about because we have a meeting this Thursday at the Walker River Irrigation District. It's an open meeting, so everybody's welcome to come to that. It's an update on some of the stuff I'm going to talk about right now. Okay. So what we see in Mason Valley is we got this, we have this pattern of steep declines and then recovery on good years and then steep declines during drought and so forth. But then we have the if we look at the long-term trend, it's about 0.3 feet per year. This is just a particular well that's in Mason Valley that we like to use as an index well to kind of highlight the what's going on. But the thing that we're seeing was that the drought in 2012, 2015, we saw a decline of 4.2 feet per year. And in the more recent drought, where our declines are 5.4 feet per year, which is even greater than it was before. But the pumping was greater in the previous drought than it was in this drought by a little bit. And so we're seeing an increasing rate of decline for a little bit less pumping. And that's a little bit scary to a hydrogeologist because that means the aquifer conditions are starting to change a little bit as the water levels go down. And so this is a bit concerning. This is Mason Valley. Now, if we go to Smith Valley, next slide. It's a lot more alarming when we're looking at those conditions. The long-term trends, 1.2 feet per year, which is, by itself may not seem that bad, but it's accelerating. That's the really big concern that we're having. Same thing here is we're looking at 6.6, almost 7 feet per year in the previous drought, 11 feet per year in the recent drought. These are really steep declines. And again, a little bit less pumping in the recent drought than the previous drought, and yet the declines are steeper this time. And so this has got us a little bit alarmed. And so we've been working with the irrigators and the groundwater users in Mason and Smith Valley to have them understand what's going on there and to start a voluntary program to figure out how can we start to get the space in a little bit better balance. But there's more to the story with this. And that's when we start to think about the connection with the stream. Next slide, please. Yeah. Well, this slide shows the total amount that's been removed from groundwater storage since 1970 for Smith and Mason Valley. So what we see is through Smith Valley is the little valley there on the lower left, and the darker reds mean greater water level declines, whereas the closer to right is less water level declines. You notice that the water level declines near the river, there's not much going on there, but as you move away from the river towards the margin of the valley, that's where all the declines are happening. Same thing with Mason, but the declines aren't as drastic in Mason Valley as they are in Smith Valley. Total amount of water that's been removed from storage since 1970 is 288,000 acre feet in Smith Valley. Which is around 5 topaz reservoir volumes full. And then for Mason Valley is 269,000 acre feet, which is around 6 Bridgeport reservoirs volumes. The other thing to point out here is that the river crosses Smith Valley along its short axis, and it crosses Mason Valley along its long axis. So it has a much longer connection in Mason Valley and ability to replenish the aquifer, if you will, in Mason Valley, whereas in Smith Valley, it doesn't have as much contact time, if you will, as much time in the basin. And so those have different patterns on the way the water level declines are happening, and on the next slide, please, and on the way the river's behaving. And this is the other key thing to know about what's going on in Smith and Mason Valley. These plots show the river efficiency, the flow efficiency. Think of flow efficiency as that the amount of water that comes into the valley, if you account for all the diversions, the amount that makes it out. So if it's a gaining river system, then it's going to have a flow efficiency greater than 100% or greater than 1 in this case. Whereas if it's losing, less water is coming out of the valley than it's coming in, then that's less than the efficiency of less than 1. And so what we're seeing in the valley, so this is all work based on Davies and Naranjo. It's right down there. But what we're seeing is that we have this long-term efficiency loss going on in West Walker River, and we're losing about 3% efficiency per decade. And in the Mason Valley, it's even more because of that longer connection and it's about 5% per decade. And it's related to the water level declines because of the way that groundwater, surface water are connected. So yeah, so next slide. I think this is the take home for Smith and Mason Valley, the ones we work with the irrigators on, and that's what we're in, this like feedback cycle on in these two valleys where we have this less flow being delivered on the river. And so in order to make up for it, we increase the pumping because supplemental pumping allows for that. And then, but the increased pumping increases the flow losses, which then reduces the flow. And so we're in this cycle. And so we talk about the cycle with those guys, and they understand and they get it. And we're trying to break out of it. And we're trying to do this in a way where, everybody's trying to work together without us coming down with curtailment. We tried that before. It didn't go great. And so we're trying a different approach. And I think Adam will talk more about, his style of approach of trying to deal with our water issues with working with the water users instead of coming down. So anyway, with that, I conclude this presentation.
Do we have any quick questions for Kip? No, we're good. Why don't we take 5 minutes, stretch our legs before we move to the next one?
You don't know. I mean, which increases evaporation.
Quit talking, Matt. Exactly. Okay, so on this next one, I think we heard we have a different presenter, so I don't want to say the name that's on my sheet. I just remember we had somebody new. So we have somebody from the United States Geological Survey.
I bet it's Karen Nadler.
It's who?
Yeah.
Karen Nadler.
Oh, she's online. Okay, I'm looking in the audience. I'm like, I don't know who's getting up
Her
here.
name's on the slide. There she is.
There you are. Hi, Kim.
Hi.
Anyway, she's going to be giving us a brief update on the role of ongoing studies using groundwater flow models in the upper and middle Carson River basins to evaluate the impact of future water management scenarios, as well as proposal to evaluate stream capture and use existing models to evaluate additional model scenarios in the middle Carson. So Carol, welcome.
Thank you. Like you said, I'm going to be presenting in Ramon Naranjo's place. I'm sorry I couldn't be there in person tonight, but I really appreciate the opportunity to be able to present remotely. I'm going to describe two ongoing studies that we're doing at the USGS. They are both groundwater modeling studies that are looking at groundwater management scenarios in the upper and the middle Carson River Basin. And then I'm going to introduce this proposed new work that we're proposing to do that would evaluate stream capture in the Carson River Basin, much like in the Humboldt. So the first project I'm going to talk about is one where we are evaluating the effects of groundwater management options on water resources in Carson Valley. I might say Carson Valley or the upper Carson River Basin, but it's kind of delineated. I hope you can see the mouse, but as the green blob on that map. So really the upstream part down to just upstream of Carson City includes Gardnerville, Minden, and much of Douglas County. So this project came about with a concern having to do with population growth in Carson Valley. The area, much like much of the Carson River Basin, experienced rapid population growth starting sometime around 1970. So this graph here is showing, is showing population on the y-axis and time starting in 1970 and ending in 2020 on the x-axis. And sorry, it keeps jumping around. Okay, but you can see it really, the increase in population was really steep right up until around 2000, 2005 or so. And then it leveled off while still increasing, just much less steeply since then. But that steep increase caused concern, and Douglas County actually capped future population growth at 2% back in 2011 in their master plan. So all this population growth is kind of connected, obviously, to an increase in demand for water in the valley. And this caused a lot of concern of what does this mean for water resources? What would additional pumping mean for the aquifer? What would it mean for stream flow? And so the objectives of this study is to update an existing model so that we can evaluate a suite of potential groundwater management options and the effect that that would have on groundwater resources, on stream flow. The existing model that we're using is one that Kit mentioned in his talk. It's the Kit Laston and others model that was published last year. It also goes by the name Water for the Seasons. So we're taking their model that was built to answer different questions, and we are giving it an update. And so that's kind of our first and second of these 4 major tasks that go along with this project, is that we are compiling data so that we could update the model and extend it out in time a bit. And then using that new data to also evaluate how well the model continues to perform now that we have more information, and see if we need to make any modifications or recalibrate it just to make sure it's still matching reality. And then our third major task group is to then take this updated, recalibrated model and run different growth rate scenarios with it and look at the effects that those scenarios or those different growth rates might have on the aquifer and on the Carson River. Those scenarios are going to be determined by stakeholders in the basin. Douglas County has started providing information and discussing scenarios, and ultimately that's going to be something that's decided by stakeholders, and then we'll take whatever information we're given, whatever realistic growth rates we should look at, and run these models. And then our final task will be to run an uncertainty analysis with these models. And so that basically gives us numbers that we can say how confident we are in the results, or what parts of the model we're less or more confident in. In this project, like I said, we're using an existing model. This model built by Kit Laston and others, they published last year, and the work began in 2015. So the model ends right around there. So we just extended it out in time a bit. But this model is really a combination of 4 models. And so this map of the upper Carson River Basin here is broken out into sections. 2 of the models are watershed models. So we have one that's a salmon color, that's the West Fork watershed model. One that's this green area is the East Fork watershed model. And what these models do is they're using modeling software called PRMS, and they're basically looking at precipitation and temperature and weather data, and they're giving us a sense of how much water is entering into Carson Valley, both superficially and subsurface. And so these 2 models are used to give information about what water's been entering into the groundwater flow model area that is shown here in this, what color is that? Kind of like a brownish green. And this groundwater flow model is really the main model. It represents all the physical processes, recharge, evapotranspiration, pumping, how the river interacts with the aquifer, how agricultural processes affect the aquifer. All of that is wrapped up into this physical model. And then this physical model, the Carson Valley groundwater model, is coupled with this water management model. And it uses something called ModSim, but it's basically an Alpine decree model. It has all the rules of the Alpine decree connected to the geographic locations of points of diversion, pumping wells. It works with the physical model to make sure that water is getting routed according to the rules of the Alpine Decree. And so these two models work together. Groundwater flow model figures out how much water is available upstream. The Alpine Decree model then routes that water. It figures out if supplemental pumping needs to be turned on anywhere, if the river is under regulation. It has all of that built in, and it gives information back to the physical groundwater flow model. And so we're really lucky to have this framework to work with. It's a complicated framework with 4 models, but we wanted to use this existing structure because it has that Alpine Decree built in. But this existing structure was built to answer questions having to do more with climate change, and the question at hand has more to do with population growth. So we're making edits to the model to make sure it's answering the right question. We're about in the middle of this project. This is just kind of showing a project schedule with those 4 major task groups. We're done compiling data. We're really in the thick of still updating the model and looking at whether or not we'll need to recalibrate it. We haven't started running any population growth scenarios, but like I said, we've started talking with stakeholders about what those scenarios will need to look like. So that's kind of a broad overview of this project. Another project we have going on in the Carson River Basin is one in the middle. And this one's being led by Nora Nelson in our office. And this project is going to be evaluating water use in the middle Carson River river basin. It's looking at stream flow, inflows to Lyon Reservoir, groundwater levels. And this model's being done to answer questions dealing with both population growth and with climate change. So some background that led to the development of this project. Just like in Carson Valley, the middle Carson was experiencing population growth. So this plot on the left, I'm not sure what the size of the screen is, but it's basically showing population on the y-axis, time on the x starting in 1900 and ending in 2010. This blue line is Carson City population. The purple line with the circles is Churchill County, and the green line is Lyon County. And for all of these, population growth wasn't really taking off until, again, sometime around 1970. Carson City population really shot up, just like in Carson Valley. Lyon County had a pretty steep increase, starting more so in the 90s. And Churchill County didn't have quite as steep of a population increase, but it had steadily been increasing. And so just like in the upper Carson River Basin, population growth also here is kind of led to concerns of where's this water going to come from? What's additional pumping or stream flow diversions? Well, how is this going to affect the water resources in the basin? On top of that, Kit Laston and others model, or the Water for the Seasons model that Kip also showed some of the results from, that model was looking at climate change and potential impacts of increasing temperature on stream flow. And these plots on the bottom right, I believe Kip showed these, or a version of these, that were showing that basically with each degree Fahrenheit temperature increase projected in these models, the timing of kind of the average amount of stream flow, stream flow was kind of routing through earlier, about a week earlier per degree Fahrenheit increase. This kind of has to do with more precipitation falling as rain rather than snow, snow melt occurring earlier. And all of this brings water flushing through the system early and earlier in the season. And then under the rules of the Alpine Decree, more supplemental pumping would be potentially occurring if that were the case. And so this combination of population growth and climate impacts on water resources caused some of the concern that it seemed like a model would be useful in helping run scenarios. So the objectives of this study are to use also an existing model to evaluate water use patterns in the middle Carson River looking at the effects of climate change and future population growth on stream flow inflows to Lyon Reservoir. So this project also has kind of 4 main task groups. One is to first take data where we can compare basically how the Kittlast and another model handles the Alpine Decree versus what happens in reality. And so the model has the rules of the Alpine Decree and it kind of follows it to a T. Whereas in reality, there might be human behavior that varies some, or there might be exceptions certain year, or you know, a ditch rider or a water master might be delivering water overall in a season under the rules of the Alpine Decree, but the week to week might look a little bit different than what the model does. And so to test this, we're working with Carson Subconservancy District they're collecting some data so that we can then look at model output and kind of see how well it reflects reality, and kind of put a bound on confidence in how well reality matches the strict rules of the Alpine Decree. So that's one task. And then another task in this project, just like the other, is to take an existing model and give it an update and get it ready to answer these more specific questions. Once that's done, the updated model will be used to evaluate impacts of climate change and water management scenarios on stream flow coming into Lyon Reservoir. And then there will also be scenarios to evaluate how water use, so groundwater pumping and diversions in both the upper and the middle Carson River basins, are contributing to stream flow trends that we're seeing. The existing model for this project is one by Morway and others. It's currently in review, but we expect it to be published in the next, hopefully in the next few months, but for sure in the next year. This one was also designed similarly to evaluate effects of proposed management strategies on groundwater resources, groundwater sustainability. So it's a good structure to start with. It also has all the bones and all the pieces that we would need. It already represents groundwater and surface water interactions. It already represents and has ways to represent evapotranspiration from crops and phreatophytes, lake evapotranspiration. It already represents recharge from mountain front recharge and from irrigation return flow. And it has a structure to represent and simulate groundwater pumping. And so this image, I'm not again sure what the resolution is there, but basically all these processes are kind of shown and color coded on this map of part of the model here. So all the bones are there, and it was already built to answer similar question, but there are some limitations, and so a kind of large update is required to then use this model. And so one of those updates is to extend it in time, both forward and backward. This graph here is showing historical record of total annual stream flow at Fort Churchill over time. So the left bounding part of the time is around 1910, and then it goes until about 2015, this whole period of record. The dark blue lines here is showing the period, the simulation period. And so this model was built to represent time between 2000 and 2010. Time has passed, and also we have data where we could extend it back in time. So part of this project is taking that time and extending it back to 1980 and forward to 2020. So it'll have the same time period as the previous study I described. Another kind of major revision is that now we're adding domestic well pumping to this model. An individual domestic well is not going to pump very much in the grand scheme of things, especially compared to other sources of pumping or types of pumping. But several domestic wells in one area can have a cumulative impact. So it's important to account for that when looking at these, looking at the bigger picture. Those are two of the major types of updates that are happening. This project is somewhere in the middle as well. Currently working on that Alpine Decree task and updating the model. All the scenario tasks, again, we're not in the phase of actually implementing or modeling any of these scenarios, but it's pretty early where the stakeholder engagement and data collection is happening, where again, just like in the other project, USGS is not going to come up with the scenarios. We're going to represent what stakeholders ask us to represent. And so that stakeholder engagement process is pretty early, and Ed James from the Conservancy District is really leading that effort. Okay, so those two projects, we have other projects in our center in the Carson River Basin, but for the kind of having time in mind, we only are presenting on those because those are two major modeling projects that are now being proposed to kind of be linked and work together in this new work where we're proposing to evaluate stream capture in the Carson River Basin. This project would kind of mimic the structure of the Humboldt River Basin capture projects. We're in the early proposal phase with this, but we wanted to kind of share what we're proposing. The objectives that we're setting out are two. So one of them, one of the major ones, is to evaluate and describe stream and reservoir capture in the Carson River Basin. And then another objective of this work is to evaluate an additional 40-40-20 scenario with that updated Morway and others model in just the middle Carson River Basin. There were some lingering questions from that Morway and other project. And so we also wanted to include in this work the chance to answer some of those lingering questions. So the approach that we're generally proposing is to take these two models that I've just described that we're already working with, and to extend both of them back in time to what we would consider or assume to be pre-groundwater development conditions. We want to have a broader picture of what's been happening so that when we do a capture analysis, we can kind of start closer to when we think pumping really started having an impact in the Carson River Basin. So that requires collecting more data, updating these models, looking at how they perform. Once that's all done, we would then analyze capture. This is kind of a big several set of tasks. Like Kip was showing, there's different types of capture analyses that we can do, and we're proposing to do two main types of analyses, where one would be it's called historical and predictive capture. And what this does is we can look at the existing pumping that has happened through time, and we can say over time, this existing pumping resulted in this stream capture over kind of like those plots with the gray bars showing pumping and the stream capture as a line over time. And then there's a predictive period with that based on the existing well distribution, and some assumptions are made where you can say, based on historical pumping, and this is kind of where we see capture going if things weren't changed, or with whatever assumptions we come up with. Another capture analysis that we're proposing is to make those capture maps and display their results in a capture query tool so that we can show potential capture. And that's really useful for answering questions of what if. I think I have a slide on this next, actually. So we're proposing to update these models, get them ready for a capture analysis, where they still are two separate model frameworks, but their grids are lined up, and we would recalibrate the edges so that there's a smooth transition between them. So computationally, it just makes sense to keep them separate, but the results can be displayed together for these. Those are all the capture approaches we're proposing. And then we also, like I said, want to revisit the 40-40-20 scenario in the middle Carson River Basin. This is basically to have some improved accounting of stream flow routing and to evaluate evapotranspiration on fallowed lands and look at kind of drought year effects of this 40-40-20 pumping scheme. This is just a slide to kind of explain why these capture maps in the query tool are useful. It's a really good tool for showing potential or hypothetical capture. So that's saying, what if I put a new well in the system right here, right there, anywhere? what effect could that have on the stream? Or what if I had a well near the stream and I moved it farther away? What would that do to the stream capture? How much would it reduce it by moving it this far away? This is a tool that basically lets us understand how pumping affects surface water sources. It's a tool that's useful for management of surface and groundwater resources. And it's a tool that would be online and would be something consistent that could be used between different stakeholders. Something like this is being done in the Humboldt. It's not online yet, but it will be when the projects are published. I won't go too into detail on this, but this is just kind of showing what a generalized capture map looks like. This is one of the products that we're proposing, where you can give this map, this heat map basically of hypothetical stream capture. And what this is showing, this is just an example from Paradise Valley, but all the red values, that these red blobs we see, is if I placed a well anywhere in this middle red blob, it would have a higher stream capture value than if I placed it in any of these blue or green blobby areas. And so it wouldn't look quite like this, but it'd be like what was done in the Humboldt, where for a given time, snapshot in time, we can give these maps to show areas where stream capture has the potential to be much higher or much lower. And then the results of all those maps, I mean, they're built by placing a hypothetical well one at a time in every place in the model. So this is like thousands, hundreds of thousands of model runs that create a ton of data. And to be able to provide all that data in one place, we're proposing this capture tool. This is an example of what's being done in the Humboldt, what it's going to look like. It's called the Humboldt Capture Query Tool. And basically you can either put in a latitude and a longitude, or you can click anywhere on the map where you want to kind of look at what capture would look like. It just needs a depth below surface. So this is kind of the screened, maybe the middle of the screened depth interval. So we know what unit is it pumping from. And then it gives these results, these curves like Kip had described, that show each component of water source to that well. Here, gray is the storage, groundwater storage. So it starts at 100%. And over time, groundwater storage becomes less and less of a source of water to this well right here. The blue is stream flow depletion or stream capture. So you can see, this well near the river, what percentage of its water does it get over time? And it seems to level off somewhere around 55%. So this tool can be used to kind of think through, where should I place a new well, or if somebody were to want to move their well. It's kind of useful for potential or hypothetical capture. And then I won't go into too much detail because Kip already explained how this works, but I would focus more on the right graph. And this is just showing the other capture analysis that we're proposing to do, where we these gray bars are pumping value, and so pumping values in the model domain, and there's this really down here low line that's the stream capture volume that's taking place based on historical and predicted pumping. So this is another analysis that we're proposing to do. Okay, so in summary, we are at the USGS actively developing and using models to guide water managers on water use projections, looking at climate change and water quality. We are going to have these model scenarios that will be used to estimate impacts to stream flow and water levels in the Carson River Basin. We also wanted to note that stakeholders are planned to discuss these project objectives, these scenarios, and address any questions about the models. And we want to kind of get that on everybody's radar. I can take any questions if there are any.
Thank you, Kara. Do we have any questions at this point in time? Not seeing anybody raise their hand. So thank you, Kara. I think we're going to go on to our next presentation.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. James. Manager of the Carson Water Subconservancy District, discussion of CWSD role in overall Carson River watershed water planning efforts and ongoing and anticipated studies, including the 30-year regional water plan for the Carson River watershed. So I just have one question. It's going to be the same presentation I see every year, but a different date.
Just moving it every year forward, what can I say? Yeah, for the
I had to
record,
ask the question.
Ed James with the Carson Water Subconservancy District, and I realized in my cover sheet, I didn't even mention the organization on this. I figured most of you know, but there's probably a lot of people who don't know. A little background on the Carson Water Subconservancy District. We were really created back in 1989 by the Nevada legislature, who realized at that time on the Carson that there was a huge demand for new water resources, but there's a limited resource already available. And how are you going to be able to meet those demands in the future? And so they felt that it was important to bring the communities together, all the counties, and really work cooperatively to try to avoid these conflicts, the things you saw in the Humboldt, thing you saw in the Walker, trying to work cooperatively to alleviate those. And so that is the purpose of CWSD. I tell people if it involves 2 or more counties, we get involved. And so that is our goal. We do flooding, we do habitat, we do water quality and water supply and a whole bunch of other things in there that involve the entire watershed to improve the overall health and benefit of the watershed. So one of the things that we're now looking at is this 30-year regional water plan. For the next 30 years, how are we going to meet those demands? What's going to happen? What are the impacts as we move forward? And so that is the purpose of this presentation, is really talk about it. We just finally got the grant that's going to fund it. We've been waiting for over a year. So a lot of this stuff is preliminary, but we are ready to move forward. We'll be hiring an engineer to help us, but we'll also be using a lot of the tools you've already heard today, the USGS and past studies, to help us get to this 30-year plan. Next, please. So what will this plan look at? We're going to look at future water demands. You've talked about growth, but what is the water demands in the future? Because that's really going to drive, and I'll show why that's more important as we get into these slides. Also, identifying where the future water sources are coming from. You just heard about the capture model, all that. Where is that water going to come from? Is it coming next to the river? Is it coming out of the river? What are the sources from? And that's what we'll be talking with each of the water purveyors, so we know where their water sources are coming from. We understand groundwater, surface water interaction. That's a critical element. You've already heard several presentations that our efforts are going to be looking at those impacts. We'll also be looking at climate change and runoff patterns. This is critical because as we develop our regional plan, the question is, if it's good in an average year, what happens in a dry year? Or what happens in a wet year? What are the impacts throughout the entire system? It's interesting. Dry years may not be the biggest impact on the lower watershed because there's so little water in the system anyway that the water is not available for everyone's needs anyway. So when is the impacts? And those are things that we'll be looking at. Infrastructure needs. What do we need to do on a regional basis if we're going to try to meet these needs? And then identify shortfalls. If there are going to be impacts, let's mitigate those. And one of the mitigation may be, no, you can't take any more water. That is something we have to look at. But if we can mitigate those are some of the things that we want to try to do to meet the demands, not just in the one part of the watershed, but the overall watershed. Next, please. So a little background on the Carson. We've already seen some of these, the sizes are there. Critical things, we have limited upstream storage. You already heard that Lyon stores about 300,000 acre feet. All the reservoirs combined in the upper watershed is less than 10,000 acre feet. So we really depend on Mother Nature to provide water to the entire region. And if Mother Nature is stingy, like she's been the last couple of years, no one gets much water. If she gives a lot, like in 2017, everyone gets too, and sometimes too much. All the surface water is allocated. There's no new water in the system. Everything is allocated through the Alpine Decree, and that is a year-to-year operation that the federal water master allocates flows. Now, the unique thing about the Alpine Decree is that it will give you water in dry years, average, and wet years. It is allocated based on what the supplies are. And that's kind of unique in this operation. So it works in all three scenarios. Also, all the groundwater is allocated, and you heard over allocated. We have more water allocated than is available. The good news is in most of the areas, we're not pumping what is above the perennial yield. But I will point out that I do not like the perennial yield definition because it does not work in this watershed at all. And I can explain later on as we go into why perennial yield really is a not good allocation. The Newlands project, you already talked about it, the critical element of that, how Carson is so critical to it, but also to the Carson Truckee Canal. Without those supplies, the Newlands project would probably not have the amount of agriculture today, because Carson in wet years can provide it all, but in dry years, there's very little to provide downstream. Next. So I'm going to show you this slide. This is the average CFS from 1940 to 2021. You see there's a slight trend line, the trend line slightly going down. That's not the important part. The important part of looking at this graph is there's no average on the Carson. It's either wet or it's dry. And if you look from 1980 forward, it's gotten worse. It's gotten wetter and it's gotten drier. We don't have average. And so that's the problem we have to deal in the Carson with very limited upstream storage. How do you manage those resources? And that's something that we are looking forward as we move forward with this plan. Next, please. The other thing to point out is what is happening on the Carson today. You know, you talk about climate change and impacts. We're already seeing changes on the Carson. This was done by DRI several years ago. And what they did was they took the data set from 1941 to 2009 and they've broken it in half. Now we use the East Fork at the upper gauge because there's very little man-made impacts upstream. So this is kind of what Mother Nature is providing us. And this is a fraction of the annual flow. This is not a hydrograph. This is a fraction of flows that occur by month in those two data sets. I'll point out in March, you'll see that there is more water coming off now than there was historically in March. Now that's a benefit to the lower watershed and the Lahontan, because when does Lahontan fill? During the winter and springtime. So this water is going down and providing it. At the same time, you look in June, we are now seeing less water coming off. So climate change has an impact up and down the entire watershed. If you're in the upper watershed, if you're a farmer, you're now seeing less water available for you to divert. You remember, most of the surface water is used by farmers up and down the watershed. And so this is something that we will be looking in our study as we move forward. Next slide, please. Another thing, and this was we hired another engineering, and we've done a lot of research. So we're going to be using all this data we've been developing over the years and the USGS work. But I want to point your eyes to the lower row. And what this is looking at stream flow from 1940 to 2018. And we are looking at if you look at the bottom one, you'll see it's the West Fork at Woodford's. And again, this is the upper gauge on the Woodfords, and we go back to 1940. And what we're seeing is, and there's very little upstream storage or development and everything else, we're almost seeing an 8% reduction in flows coming down the upper watershed. So we're already seeing an impact again in the upper watershed. On the East Fork, and the East Fork is a larger watershed, it's a higher elevation, we're seeing an impact of about 4%. So when you combine the two, we're seeing about an average of less than 5% reduction over this period of time of water coming down the watershed. Now, if you go down to the Carson City one, this one now records what happens through Carson Valley. So now you have the man-made diversions, you have groundwater pumping and all that, and you'll see that the change is almost 9%. So we are seeing an impact as it moves through Carson Valley. And then we get down to Fort Churchill, and you'll see the impact is just under 4%. So the impact is actually less than what you see in the upper watershed. What's easy to point out on that is we have a lot less agriculture in the lower watershed than we did historically. And I'll have some slides to show that. So that's probably one reason why you're not seeing the impact as severe today as you would have if we didn't have this reduction in agriculture. Next slide. So we already talked about the modeling effort. So when we're going to be doing this regional plan, we're using the latest and greatest information that the USGS has put together. Because they're the scientists, they know, they can actually look at what's the groundwater, surface water impacts. We want to be utilizing those. And so we are using what the USGS has put together, and we've already talked about water for the seasons. Next, please. So this is, you already saw the slide. This is a great model. It actually models the groundwater, surface water interaction. It models the alpine decree to a T. The problem is there are so many human variables in the upper watershed year to year. So sometimes you may see a senior water user not take their water. But because it's always been a water shortage, Carson Valley has never had enough water to meet its irrigation needs in most years, that if a senior user doesn't use it, a junior will. And so that water is being used in the Carson Valley. And so we know that we have these opportunities. We have a great model, but actually how we're going to see the impact is something we're going to have to analyze closely with the USGS. Next, please. We already talked about the Middle Carson. They're upgrading. It's a great model. It's going to give us a tool looking at the interaction, groundwater, surface water. They did a lot of work, but there is some refinement we have to do. A couple things is we're expanding the period of study, but also there's some things that changed since the original assumptions that went into this model. Next, please. One of the things was this was work earlier done by Maurer in 2011. There was a report prepared by them, and they looked at groundwater impacts in the Eagle Valley. This is the Carson City area. And they were showing water levels dropping significantly in this area from 1964 to 2009. And that's what the report was showing. Well, what's happened since then is Carson City is now taking water from Carson Valley, 3,000 acre feet a year. And so that is reducing how much water they're actually pumping here. That's putting a stress in the Carson Valley, but we're not seeing those water levels dropping anymore. We're actually seeing them recover because they are not pumping that. And that's something that we need to make sure that the model will show as we move forward. Next, please. So one of the things too is we're gathering all the data from the different entities. And so we've been going through gathering all the information. It's preliminary at this point because we weren't ready to move forward on until we got the grant. We finally did. So we're going to actually finalize it. And we'll be meeting with each of the water purveyors to verify the data. But this is kind of showing what the municipalities, the water usage has been going on in the different areas. Now we have the Carson Valley. So this is the major municipalities. The area circled in red is data I don't think is correct. And this is something we have to go back and look into the details. We found a lot of errors. I was able to correct some of that data, but we still have some questions in my mind that I don't think is correct. Carson City is Eagle Valley, but also surface water they get. You can also see that their usage is going down over the last 20 years. So even though they've grown, their water usage is less today than it was 20 years ago. And this is standard throughout the entire West. You look at Clark County, you look almost anywhere, that even though they've grown, there is less water being used today by a municipality than there was historically. Lyon County, you can see it's fairly close across there. Again, where I circled red, question that. I think the data is not correct. I think the numbers should be up higher. And that's something we need to meet with the different individuals. And then with Churchill County, again, the data we have the last couple of years don't make sense to me. I think we're missing some data there. And so we need to go back and verify. So this is something that we'll be doing in the study, is verifying the water usage as we move forward. Next, please. So one of the things too is we want to look at, because that's just the municipalities. What about the rest of the water use being used? And so the state engineer publishes a groundwater pumping record in most of the groundwater basins in our watershed. So this is a long-term record set. And so this is something that we're looking at. This is in Carson Valley. Now I have let you know that I found some errors in the data and we are updating those. So that, again, there's some things that we want to correct as we move forward, but this is probably a very good indicator of what's happening right now in the watershed. Now you might look at the one in the upper right and say, wait a minute, municipal water use is going up. Ed, you showed the other one, the water was going down, municipal use. Two things on this graph. One, it's a much longer period. This goes to 1991. The other one went 2003. The second, this includes Carson City's pumpage from Carson Valley. So when you start looking at, you're going to have 3,000 acre feet more water coming out of the Carson Valley for municipal use because Carson City is now taking that water. But what this shows is there has been an increase. Whoops, you can see the two, Carson Valley and then here. The other thing is look at the groundwater pumping. You are seeing a trend that's going up. So we are seeing an increase in municipal water use. We're also seeing an increase in agriculture. So we saw drier periods. They have to pump more. So when it's a dry year, like 2015, you're going to see higher pumping. When it's a wet year, you're going to see less pumping. And those trends are going to go up and down again as we see climate change. There are also a lot of other users. There's domestic use, there's wildlife, there's quite a bit of a large water use there, but they're fairly stable, back and forth. We don't see a huge trend of those changing in the future. Next, please. So here's Eagle Valley. So this is a pumping record just in Eagle Valley. Now this one has a perennial yield of 4,900 and a system yield of 9,000. Now I was telling you there's problems with perennial yield. Actually, if you go back to the last one, sorry. In Carson Valley, the perennial yield is 49,000 acre feet, and you can see that the pumping has never come close to that. It's gotten up to almost 40,000, but not quite. So you think, oh, well, they're way below their perennial yield. The problem is Carson River goes right to the middle of Carson Valley. And so even though they may not be pumping perennial yield, they are probably pumping surface water. And so that's a concern that we want to look at. So a perennial yield indication here is probably not a good number. We really need to look at what's happening with the surface and groundwater interaction. Next one, please. So with Carson City, they have two. They have a perennial yield, but they have a system yield. And the reason for the difference there is that a perennial yield just looks at the natural amount of water that's available, but they also have Kings Canyon, they have Ash Canyon, and they get water from the Marlet system. They bring that over and recharge their aquifer. So the state engineer years ago recognized that their yield is probably greater than their perennial yield because these are all alternatives. And you can see again the long-term pumping here. I will point out that in 1995, that's probably not a correct data because there's no way they're looking at the data set and say, how can they reduce that much significantly? I've looked at climate, I've looked at temperatures and everything else. There's probably an error in that data set, but there's no way to go back because I can't get those records there. But again, these are things you have to look at. You have to look at the data itself and say, does this make sense? But you can then see the pumping in Eagle Valley for the municipal, and you can see it going up during the 2000s, quite a bit, growth and all that pumping, and then you're seeing it drop off. And again, that's because they're now taking water from Carson Valley. Also, their water usage has gone down just by overall use. And a lot more lawns have been taken out. So their overall use has been decreasing. There are also other users in Carson Valley, but you can see that they're also declining over the years. Next, please. So this is the Dayton Valley groundwater basin. Total pumping, you'll see it going down. The biggest reduction is agriculture. We've lost a lot of agriculture and it's going down, and that impacts are there. So we still have some there, but we just don't have as much agriculture as we did historically. The municipal water use in Dayton is also decreasing over the years. They got some other water uses. They are increasing slightly, but the magnitudes you can just see over there with the overall picture of today. Next, please. So this is Churchill Valley. So when I say Churchill Valley, it's Silver Springs. People are like, what is Churchill Valley? No, Churchill County is actually Carson Desert. This is a little confusing, but this is Silver Springs here. And so you can see the overall pumping in Silver Springs. It's running at about 2,400 acre feet. You can see irrigation going up and down, basically based on a dry year or wet year. The municipality has dropped significantly. So there's less water being there. The biggest user, though, if you look at the numbers, is domestic use. If you look at total, the most water used in this area here comes from domestic use. And that is something there. The other thing is you can't see the perennial yield. The perennial yield here is only 1,600. So they're actually using more water than the perennial yield here. And so that is a concern, especially when it's close to the river and reservoir. So this is something that the state engineer is starting to put a restriction. The municipal water district has over 5,000 acre feet on the books. They'll never be able to use it. That's all paper water. So there is a question of how much water will actually can be developed in here, but I just want to let you know the trends here. People are being more efficient, especially in municipalities with their water use. I don't have a pumping record for the Carson Desert. The state engineer does not produce one of those. So again, we just have to go to the individual to try to gather that information, but there's not an annual report printed out. Next, please. So one of the things too is looking at the ditches in the area. So this is from the Mexican ditch, which is in Carson City, all the way down to La Hontan Reservoir. What is happening with the irrigation in those reaches? Next, please. So we've looked at all the data sets. We've gone through. A couple things I want to point out here is that everything you see in yellow, and there's about over a dozen ditches here, there's a math error there. So I call this the raw data, the federal water master here. When we went through, we found math errors, so we're correcting those. The blue is also different here because during that period of time, the ditch writer would go out and look at it and say, okay, are you diverting water? Oh, it may be for stock watering. So if he said it was for stock watering, he would say 0 diversion. Because stock watering is that. Well, I went and talked to the old time ranchers and I said, would you have done that? Would you not have taken any water during that period in the summertime on your fields? Because in the other periods you see above and below. And he said, no, if there's water, we're going to irrigate with that. So there's a little discrepancy in where that data set. So we have the raw data, we have the corrected math data, and then we went back and tried to estimate what those fill in those blue spots there on the data set. Why is this important? The USGS is using this in their modeling efforts. And they just use the raw data. It's not really giving you a good indication of what happened historically. So we want the correct data. Next, please. Whoops. So what we have here are the graphs. So if you look at the orange, that is the raw data. That is what came through the federal water master. The gray is the corrected with the math errors corrected. And you can see they're fairly close. And then the blue is the estimate to filling in the gaps, because we also had a couple of ditches that they said they weren't taking any water. Well, we went and looked at area photographs historically. We know that they were taking water. The fields were irrigated. So they just weren't out there and recording it. So when you put the blue in, you can actually see this is kind of an estimate. And again, it's a best guess. I mean, you could have different people estimating differently, but all 3 trend lines show a reduction in agriculture. And that's what's happening there. We are seeing less agriculture today than we did historically. And that's just because a lot of the lands have been taken out of production. So this is the data set that will need to go into the model as we make sure we have the correct information to move forward. So next one. So I guess just with questions, this was actually taken in Carson Canyon. And that's not it's a real picture. That's what it looks like down there. It's a gorgeous area when you ever get down there, a chance to see it between Carson and Lyon County. So basically the summary is that we're taking everything that we know, the data sets and all this, and we're going to be putting into the best models that the USGS has and looking at, okay, what are the possible impacts? Taking the realistic demands, look at us move forward and say, here is the plan we have so we can avoid hopefully what we see on the Humboldt or on the Walker. And then cooperation is our key goal here, that everyone in the Carson is protected and they can take their water rights correctly. So that's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. James. Well, since I've already seen one commissioner get up, let's take 5, stretch our feet, legs. Only one. So yeah, let's take a quick 5 and then let's finish up. Okay, Mr. Sullivan, Nevada State Engineer with NDWR, State Engineer perspective on what your perspective is going to be a good perspective or a bad one. Anyways, on water issues facing the state with particular emphasis on the Carson River watershed, implementation of anticipated NDWR policies and new federal stimulus funding for water. Welcome.
Thank you. There's some good and bad. Mostly I tend to be pretty optimistic, and one of the things I wanted to point out is that we've been doing a lot of public meetings around the state, and it really strikes me how fortunate you are in the Carson River Basin to have organizations like the Sub-Conservancy District that have just years of work on this issue and a lot of good data to work with and a lot of good relationships built and outreach. And not all parts of the state have that kind of resource. And also the USGS, the work that's being done with support from the district, also from the counties. You're in a good position with that. Fundamentally,
That smile's scary.
just the opening statistics that Chris Mahana opened up with the amount of over appropriated water compared to the water resource, and you wonder how we got to that point. And really, with that kind of overcommitment, what's the right thing to do for the community? And I'm relatively new on this job. I'm taking the perspective of this is what we've got to work with. What do we do from here going forward? So I just want to talk like you said, a little bit about my perspective, some of the water rights context. That's something that hasn't really come into the conversation much tonight, and some of the role of the state in helping to deal with the issue. And then there's a lot that I could talk about. I don't want to go on very long. It's late. There might be questions, and I'd rather hear from you and be able to answer those questions. Kip talked about how this is not just a Carson River issue. It really is statewide. All of our river systems are facing sort of similar problems, and all over the West, we have similar, really globally. This is an issue of groundwater aquifers being able to support the water demand. By no means are you in it by yourself. It's also come up that from the state engineer's perspective, this is not a new issue. My predecessors at DWR have struggled with the issue, have done incrementally work to try to be helpful. It's as we go on in time, we get better data, we have better tools to address it, we have more willingness to talk about it, and sort of collectively figure out what the best ways to solve these problems are in the long term for water security, rather than point fingers. That gives me a lot of optimism. As far as my approach in representing the state engineer's office is, number one, just be realistic about what the water budget science is telling us. We've seen so much good work. There's really nothing that I disagree with. It's really nice that we have the expertise to be able to go through that. And that's the kind of basis that we will need going forward to address these problems. The water budget is just telling us that in the long run, relying on groundwater supplies eventually comes out of the Carson River. There's ways to manage it that can optimize the resources, but to ignore some of the kind of the basic water budget science is it'll continue to get worse unless we start taking action. Groundwater models are a great tool to just help identify what the timing and the magnitude of the relationship is, and guide us in making defensible and effective decisions about what you can do to avoid conflict in the long run. Okay, so water rights. So we haven't talked very much about water rights. And what we're talking about, there's not enough groundwater to support all the groundwater rights that are out there. And water rights have certain private property protectable interests that are I mean, it's a valuable asset to the people who hold those rights. So we get into the conflict of the private property held by an individual versus the public interest and the public ownership of the water resource itself. We're also talking about groundwater that supports the communities up and down the Carson River, that provides people's drinking water. It's easy to say that we need to pump less groundwater. It's not so easy to do. On its face, water law really gives very few options for how to manage the dilemma of not having enough water to go around. What water law tells us is that if there's not enough water to serve all priorities, then senior water rights get the water, junior water rights don't get any. That is not a very, that's sort of a harsh situation. It makes sense kind of in a river system where the water's either there or it's not, and you either divert it or you're not. In a groundwater system, it's much harder to draw that line of how much is too much. And especially in a heterogeneous aquifer, it's just not quite a common pool where that kind of approach is effective. Secondly, what water law provides for, so it was mentioned that there's all these water rights out there, but the actual pumpage is much less than what the perennial yield is. So we have a lot of water rights that aren't in use. They're in good standing, but they're just not pumped to their full amount. If a water right is not used at all, whether it's in a permit status or a certificate status, the owner needs to apply for extensions of time. And our office reviews these extensions of time. And we actually process about 6,000 of these per year statewide. There's a lot of extensions of time coming in, a lot of water rights that aren't in use. The water law is generally pretty favorable towards the water right holder. There's just both a tradition and case law that supports giving people the benefit of the doubt, proving extensions of time. I will say that we have, recognizing the issue that you have here and really statewide, is try to put more scrutiny on those existing water rights. And is there really good faith and reasonable diligence towards using that water in the long term? Is there really water available to support that water use? And we've taken gradual measures to try to communicate that. There is a standard that needs to be met. Just as a state, and what state law provides for our options, it's one of those areas where it makes sense to try to reduce the commitments that are out there to get it more in line with actual water supply, and that's one way to do it. So again, as far as my approach going forward, I think the only way that, or the best way for the state to interact with local communities is really think about what's the right thing to do for communities affected, considering local plans, really working within what you're able to build with like the Sub-Conservancy's 30-year water plan. It's important that the state doesn't take actions that cause undue harm to local communities without really understanding what the impacts of the decisions are. And conservation, that's an element that is I think comes in everybody's mind. It's water law isn't really doesn't mesh well with conservation. It's a use it or lose it type of situation. I don't want to be in a position of penalizing conservation. And that's something that happens at a local scale and a policy scale. And then a couple last points, using models as operational tools for effective local solutions is very appealing to me. I think that's the direction that we need to go, and make use of the science and the data and the the technical basis that we have. Models really don't give us all the answers, but it's a really good tool that can keep getting better as you go on, as you get more data, and be able to support good decisions. We will learn from what happens in other parts of the state, like the Humboldt, as was mentioned, that the problems with capture are further developed in the Humboldt, and that's a good example. It doesn't mean that's what would work in the Carson system or other systems, but it's something that we can build on or learn from. So yeah, last point. I mean, as it's my responsibility to really take a perspective through this seniority lens. It's important that we consider and protect senior water right holders. It's also important that we really think about the whole system and take actions that can be complementary to local plans and don't cause any undue harm. But really, in the long term, we'll need to do things to reduce the commitments on our groundwater resources. And I hope to be able to work with you to come up with some effective and lasting solutions. And if you have questions, or if you want to make some points while I'm here listening, please fire
Hey,
away.
you guys have been saving up all night, right? So fire away. Any questions? Commissioner Olson, anybody from your side?
So you spoke a little bit about the over appropriation part, and that was discussed at length here with the Carson River in particular. Are there any ideas out there that have been thrown out to try and mitigate that, or I heard you say that we're waiting to see what comes out of the Humboldt. Are we waiting for court decisions, do you think, or maybe action from the legislature? Lots of hand grenades I just threw you, so.
Yeah, there's a lot of pieces there. The legislature is hearing a lot from different angles about what should or shouldn't be done through water law to address some problems, including conjunctive management. I can't say where that's going, but I'm anticipating a lot of water bills again this session. As far as you bring up court decisions, another important point is every decision that comes out of our office is subject to judicial review, and when it involves taking away water rights or potentially taking away water rights, you better believe that it's going to judicial review. So that's an important consideration. Everything that we do has to really be backed up and defensible. And that's where, another important reason for having good science, good models, good alternatives analysis that are vetted before and communicated publicly before you take any sort of administrative action, because you want it to work.
Is that on now?
You're
Is it
on, yeah.
My concern is wells that are within a quarter mile from the river. A lot of people would possibly say, especially developers would say, we're not drawing from the river, but a well within a quarter of a mile from the river is pulling from the river. At least that's my opinion. Is there anything that can prohibit and save the river and protect the river?
you bring up a good point. I mean, the closer you are hydraulically to the river, the more immediate that capture is. And that's a lot of, that's what we've been talking about for the last couple of hours.
2
It is
hours.
Yeah. You got it. Is there anything we can do? And I just realized that there's a whole piece of my talk that I forgot to present to you, which was the federal funding, and I'll be really quick. But I just want to point out that there's in the last interim finance committee, the legislature approved 3 different water related expenditures of ARPA stimulus money. One is to work between the state DWR and the USGS and DRI to work on statewide on improving kind of the baseline science that we rely upon to make decisions about water availability. And that's building on a lot of science that was done in 50 to 70 years ago. It's not necessarily bad, but we have a lot of information to add to that. So that's one. The second one is a little bit of funding for our office to digitize and preserve some of our historic records and streamline some of our processes. And then the third one is sort of unformed, but this is $100 million that's being routed through the Department of Conservation and Natural Resources to support water conservation and infrastructure projects statewide. It's all got to be spent within 4 years by the end of 2026. So there's this kind of mad push to figure out how to structure how to prioritize projects, how to solicit proposals and get that distributed in ways that you get the most bang for the buck. And I know the intent is to award that money by this summer. But I can't say exactly how, the timing between now and then. But there's a lot of opportunity there. I've had some voice in ideas about how to prioritize projects, and my emphasis is on remembering that we're talking about conserving water. There's a lot like so pumping close to the river, supporting aquifer storage projects, reducing consumptive loss that's not beneficial. There's a criteria that I'm hoping to make sure gets included that really measures the amount of water that you're conserving, you're actually reducing the commitments or the use of, and where that's happening, and so in the relative benefit of that.
So we're gonna be able to use this for some of that upstream storage that everybody's talked about tonight.
In my mind, that would be a great proposal for the intent of that appropriation.
This might be a question for Ed or for Chris. I don't know. But I'd like to just delve into this a little bit further. Is there any ways that we can come up with some preventative measures for Douglas, Carson, Lyon, particularly, I'm talking about upriver from the Lyon Reservoir, to restrict drilling away from the river?
Restricted away from?
Yeah, at least a quarter of a mile or more.
This may be something that Chris Mahana could be involved with, but several years ago, Churchill County was very concerned about this whole issue there. And so every time there was a proposed well or transfer, they were challenging those water rights in Lyon County. And we could see at Separate Conservancy the friction it was causing in the watershed. And so one of the things that we talked was the concern was if you didn't protest the water right, you have no say. And so you're protesting to protect your interest in there. And so we brought the groups together, and basically Chris was there and others, and said, okay, what is the intent and concerns? So before an entity would actually submit an application, we brought everyone together and talked about it. And most of the time we were able to say, okay, what are the concerns? And the biggest one, of course, was getting too close to the river. And so a lot of times those wells were looked at trying to move further away. And that was one way cooperatively we were doing that in the watershed. And that's kind of our goal, is if we can work cooperatively up front and identify, because when I go to the upper watershed, I definitely tell them, the people down the lower watershed are concerned what you guys are taking, because that's water coming down to them.
Yeah.
And then when I go in the upper watershed, a lot of people say, hey, we ought to build a dam. Look at all this water going by. I go, well, that water is going somewhere else right now, and the demand's downstream. So there is that interaction. And I think there's awareness too, that sometimes we have to always bring up, as you guys are going to have new commissioners. There's new commissioners in Lyon, Carson, all that. It's always educating people, because people think water comes from their tap. And it's just that if we can constantly bring up we can avoid what they are in the Humboldt, because I guess I'll tell you, the Humboldt is in a world of hurt.
Yeah.
Through farmers and down there. And if we can avoid that in the, the Newlands project, that's one of my major goals.
Thank you, Ed.
Yeah, Buzz, and I apologize if I added some confusion. There's no magic line, quarter mile, half mile, where a well isn't going to affect a river. That came out of kind of a long-standing rule that the state engineer had, that if you were within a quarter mile of a river, you had to solid case the upper 100 feet of the well. Up until, I don't know, 10 years or so ago, that was kind of a common philosophy that would take care of the problem. Science has dictated that is not the case at all. I mean, at one of Ed's forums, probably 20 years ago, I asked somebody who's no longer at the state engineer's office, but fairly high up, and that was the answer he gave me. Solid case well within a quarter mile, we're all good. And that's simply not the case. So what Kara and the USGS and what we're proposing with this capture model, what's being done on the Humboldt, is to determine, if you drill a well quarter mile and pump it for this long, this is how much is going to come from surface water. This is how much going to come from storage. This is how much going to come from reduced evapotranspiration. We drill a well over here, mile from the river. What's that percentage going to be? And then they develop these capture maps, and the state engineer and the USGS has developed this capture query tool where you can input that for any location in the model domain and figure that out. So that's the process we're in right now. And like Ed said, Churchill and the tribe were protesting, and the science hadn't really evolved yet. There was controversy. So we're trying to develop the science. Then the next step is to determine, all right, how do we deal with this? And there's a variety of solutions, but there's no one size fits all. I mean, Colorado does this. It's called augmentation plans, where they acquire surface water, they put it in recharge basins, and then they have the system modeled well enough for that seepage to return back to the river to augment or counteract the capture of groundwater pumping. So it's a complex thing. And part of what's happened in the last 20 or 30 years is just education, folks like you, folks in the audience, of what groundwater, surface water interactions are in this whole capture issue, because it's been a controversial issue over the years. So I hope that clarified it a little bit.
Both of you helped a lot. Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, Chris Mahan.
Commissioner Jacobson, you got a question or comment?
Thank you, Madam Chair. This might be from Mr. Sullivan. If I could. And I just need some clarification. You were saying about if someone doesn't use some of their water rights, they may lose them or unused. Do you recall that at all, or I'm just trying to clarify this for my own.
Okay. if you have a water right that's permitted, it's for a particular place and manner of use, and you have a certain amount of time in which you have to put it to use. If it's not, if you haven't done anything within that time, you need to get extensions of time, and those extensions of time are subject to review and either approving or denying. So that's yeah.
All right, so that
water right can be lost.
that answers that part, but then you look at the conservation. It seems like if someone's not using their water, they may be conserving, but yet if they're conserving or not using their water right, all of a sudden they've got to write a review. Everybody, please don't take my water from me because I'm conserving. That seems to encourage people to use water when they don't want to use it because they don't want a government official to please don't take my stuff. It makes no sense to me. So I guess I'm just trying to understand that.
Yeah, you bring up a good point. I mean, that's always the balance. You don't want to discourage conservation, but the law tells us that if you're not using the water, it should be available for the next person in priority. That's the concept. The other aspect of that is if you hold a water right that's certificated, that has been used in the past, and you've demonstrated beneficial use, you hold that certificate. The owner needs to not use water at all for a period of 5 consecutive years before they're even subject to review for potential forfeiture. And the review of forfeiture is protective. So if you have a good reason for why the water is not in use, then extensions can be granted. But where we need to find that balance is if someone's really doesn't have the intent to put that water to use, or a need for it, then it shouldn't be. Then we shouldn't continue to provide those extensions. It should the concept of water law is that should go away. But you're right. It's a balance with conserving water and protecting someone's water right.
Oh, one more, Madam Chair.
Okay.
And then, if you have any suggestions on how we handle the growth, we would love to hear them. So anything that you can give us on how to control growth and the people coming in, drinking water and whatnot, taking showers would be great for us too. Because that's a challenge for us here in Lyon. I know that. Thank you.
Anybody else from my side of the aisle over here? No? Okay.
There's a question here.
I have a question for Adam.
Well, hang on one second, just one quick second. So you guys, we're all good right now. So why don't we just go ahead and go to public comment on this? And Matt, I'll just start with you because you got a question anyways. It's kind of a workshop. So, but I do need you to go on record up here. I can't let you talk from your seat.
Matt Clarkson, General Manager, Silver Springs Mutual Water Company.
Okay, I'm gonna ask you to say that again into the microphone so it's on.
Close. It sounded weird when I was sitting over there, so I thought if I backed up, it would sound better. Matt Martinson, Silver Springs Mutual Water Company. My question was for Mr. Sullivan, and it was pertaining to extensions of time. And all the recent extensions of time are coming with an extension warning notice. And I was just curious, is that extension warning notice the notice prior to cancellation of water right extension or permits? So. Or is that boilerplate and coming out with all of the extensions at this time that are accepted, approved?
So this is something we've recently done to bring public awareness to what the law says, and to make, especially in areas where we have problems, where there's a lot of over appropriated water, to get the dialogue going about what do you really want to do here. And it's this point that we just talked about. There are some cases where we've looked at an extension of time and the applicant has received 10 or 20 years of extensions of time, and there's been no demonstration of beneficial use, and we've canceled that permit. And they call us up and say, what changed? You've been approving these year over year over year, and now suddenly you're not going to approve it. And so I realize that it's just important that we are as transparent as we can be. And it's not a precursor to canceling those permits. It's merely exactly what it says is we have problems in this basin, and we need to talk with you about what, your long-term strategy is, and try to mesh what water law provides for with what the community needs are, and trying to not use more than we got.
So basically you just painted a bigger bullseye on your back. Okay, if you have public comment, please line up so that we know, and let's go from there. 3 minutes is the rule.
Oh, okay. My name is Randall Green. And if you own 5 acres and another piece of property, 5 acres and 5 acres, and haven't done nothing to it, you once after such a period of time. And the ground water, sometimes it collapses, so you have less ground storage because ground collapses and stuff. That's my 2 concerns. Huh? Oh yeah, sure.
So, Mr. Sullivan, real quick, I know I got somebody stepping up here, but just to kind of hit on Randy's question, can you kind of give us an overview? He's talking about 5 acres, people are on domestic wells, which is a lot different than the water issue that we're actually discussing tonight. So could you clarify that for him? Oh, I can. I mean, either way.
I'll just make the point that it's not clear that a domestic well doesn't need to have a water right permit. And as was mentioned earlier, where we have a lot of domestic well lots, that can add up to a lot of water use. Even though that is not so, the domestic well owner doesn't need a whole water right permit, still needs to be recognized that they're drawing from the same resource.
Does he have to do anything? It work whatever, a year or
No.
for now. I mean,
Okay.
Yeah, domestic wells have special protection to recognize that.
Thank you, Mr. Sullivan. And Randy, if you have any more questions, you can ask him after the meeting. Thank you. Okay, if you could please state your name for the record.
Yeah, my name is Thomas Dean, and I live here in Silver Springs. I was wondering, with regards to the models, are you accounting for the change in or the increased use of drip irrigation as opposed to sprinklers and all that? Because it's a worldwide trend to save water. I'm just wondering if that's added into the models. That's it.
Do I have any other public comment, questions? Kind of letting it build up here.
I'll just jump up real quick and just introduce myself. So I'm Ben Shawcroft, the new general manager for TCID. So wanted to at least come up and say hi and look forward to future interactions with you all. This is I was kind of asked to give a little bit of perspective from TCID's on some of these issues that we've been talking about tonight. So I and I will keep to my 3 minutes, but I'm gonna make it 2. These are hugely important, obviously. Yeah, obviously, they're hugely important, and you all have a very challenging job in trying to manage that. You have developers knocking on your door and presenting maps and such, and you got to figure out, well, where's the water going to come from? And so I have kind of a unique perspective, and given the fact that I came from the Churchill County District Attorney's Office and worked with these gentlemen quite a bit, and dealing with the same issues that you all are dealing with. And so, yeah, from TCID's perspective, we would encourage, all of you folks who sit on these types of boards to, take very seriously these issues and these conflicts that can arise between surface water users and underground water users. It's not an easy conflict to solve, but we do think that there are land use policies that you can put in place, master plans you can put in place, regulations concerning developments that are coming in to try to get a hold on that, because I do like seeing some of those graphs that showed, some of that municipal use going down. And I think that's because there's this new awareness of how scarce that resource is. And so I think those tools are available that we need to just look at a little bit closer and try to implement here in Northern Nevada as well. And educate the public as well as far as how important that is. But we recognize the pressure that's put on agriculture to conserve as well. And TCID is in the process of going through a modernization plan to try to identify areas where TCID can conserve water as well, and just be more responsible for that valuable resource. So anyway, good to see you all, and we'll look forward to more conversations.
Appreciate your comments. Please. So, Mr. Frey, any words of wisdom tonight? You didn't stand up, so I just figured
My name is Robert Frey, F-R-E-Y for the record, and I've worked as state engineers over the last 30 years. Or well, make that 40. It happens quickly, but the question for Mr. Jacobson of what can we do? You need to plan, make sure that your county master plan has a water component to it. As a commissioner in Churchill County, that was one of our big projects. And then you have to monitor that plan, monitor your groundwater basins. Now, Churchill County is easy. We got one groundwater basin and we have one community. Very aware of the complexities of your area that you're in charge of. But keep in mind, we try to be good neighbors. But if there is over pumping, and it doesn't matter whether it's from municipal industrial uses, domestic well uses, or whatever, any over pumping comes out of that Carson River. And Mr. Sharman, or Commissioner Sharman, I disagree that the quarter mile has any validity. It can be 5 or 10 miles, depending on the soil structure in that period of time. So I have been a big proponent through Nevada Association of Counties and now through Central Nevada Regional Water Authority, Churchill County, and groundwater management plans as part of your plant master plan. But if you don't have it perfected, work on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Frey. Anybody else for public comment? Please state your name.
Yes, Don Smith from Wellington. 2 questions for the state engineer. One, in a meeting this past spring in Smith Valley, there was a discussion about the water shortage. And I don't recall the what made this happen, but someone from the state, I don't know what department, made a suggestion. Somebody brought up the issue of transferring water from one use to another. And it was suggested that when that happens, the person has to get a permit. And that would be an opportunity to reduce the amount of acre foot feet that is transferred. And I was wondering if that program, if anything has happened with that program. And two, I wonder how many permits have been discontinued and how much water has been saved by lack of use following the use it or lose it law in the state. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Sullivan, while it's fresh in your mind, you just heard the questions. Did you want to address those? I know it kind of veered south to back to Smith Valley here.
Please.
Please come up to the mic. We gotta try to keep you on record.
Questions there, and I think I got most of it. How much has been actually taken off the books, I think was the last question.
Right.
And not very much. It is a very gradual, deliberate process. It's protective by design. However, like I said, we've been trying to do it. It's part of our responsibility, and within the capacity that we have as a small state agency, we've been doing it in cases where it seems like that's what the law tells us to do. Second, the first question was about
The manner of the use.
the changing manner of use and then reducing the duty associated for the amount of water for that permit. I guess if I'm understanding that correctly, so there's a lot of different individual circumstances that you might be thinking about. And for instance, one thing that we do is if there's an irrigation permit and it's being changed to a commercial use, for instance, we look at the consumptive use of water, and we'll only change that amount. And the idea is that you're honoring the water budget, not creating more water, because in irrigation, there's a certain amount of return flow, and you have to consider that and change that. So that's an example that where we try to really look at the actual consumptive use of a water right and not create more water. I hope that answers the question.
If it didn't, you can talk to him when we're done here. Anybody else for public comment? Well, we got a quiet crowd tonight. How about you guys? Y'all good down there?
Good.
Any questions for us? No? No pitchforks?
Thank you. Thanks for inviting us.
Okay, well, gentlemen, I want to thank you for joining us here in Silver Springs and getting a little bit of updated information. I was joking around about the same presentation with a different date. I know it takes years and years for that data to change, and so, but I'm glad at least we're moving forward and getting some new answers, and with answers, we can solve problems, right? So do I have any more comments from my side of the board over here?
Thank those folks that came down to speak to us tonight from out of the area and the experts, and I valued their information, and also thank the commissioners from Churchill for coming over. Thank you.
Thank you.
Commissioner Henderson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to echo Commissioner Jacobson's comments, and then also, there's a saying out here in the West that, whiskey's for drinking and water's for fighting, and I'm ready to quit fighting for tonight. Yeah, hey, you catch on quick, big boy.
I just say the same thing, that we have a good group up here. Hopefully we can work together and solve some of these issues in the future. Certainly try over the next few years to discuss more things and look at master plan issues and things such as that. Thank you for the long drive. I'll drive all the way back to Wellington this evening. Luckily, the roads are dry. So
Yeah,
everybody be careful out there, and Merry Christmas.
Yeah.
So that, we all good?
I may.
Commissioner, or Chairman, excuse me, Olson.
I just like to thank everybody for coming over here tonight and sitting through these presentations. It's a really complicated thing, and after being around this now for 12 years at this level,
some of it's starting to sink in, Ed and Kip and Chris. And that's why I think that it's important to have these kind of workshops, because you're not going to get it all on the first go. And there's a lot of misconceptions out there. And knowledge in this forum where we're here together, I think is really important. I think Ben brought up some really good points. He does have that great cross section of knowledge coming from the municipal side with the county and our system. He very much understands what you folks go through with the challenges of development. We have some of those same challenges in Churchill County. So I think it was about 5 years since we did this, and I don't think we should let it go that long. I honestly think we should get together every several years in a joint workshop like this, because commissioners change, come and go. So I want to thank everybody for being here tonight.
Communication is key.
Yes.
So I want to also mention, I want to welcome Commissioner Sharman back to Churchill County.
Oh, thank you.
Nice to have you back
Thank
in
you.
our neighboring county. And then I also want to recognize that we have 2 commissioner elects that will be stepping onto their boards in January. So we have Commissioner Keller elect in the back of the room for Lyon County. And then we've got Commissioner, I forget your first name, but anyways, Commissioner Ghetto for Churchill County, sitting here next to Mr. Frey. So welcome, and I hope you had a chance to learn a little bit tonight and listen. And and if you didn't learn a lot, you're sitting next to Norm. I know you got Pete and these guys. Yeah, they'll whip you into shape in no time. So anyways, thank you everybody for coming out. And I know it's cold out there, so I appreciate it. So with that being said, do we have any other commissioner comments? I'm just going down the line just to be sure.
Motion
Nobody?
adjourned.
Okay, did that. So we are adjourned.